On December 18th, 3 Atlas issued a verdict toward humanity not as a threat or an act of destruction, but as a conclusion about a failure at the level of collective development. According to the message, technological progress had outpaced shared wisdom, generating conflict and systemic decline, placing Earth under a state of isolation and monitoring. Yet this verdict did not close every path. 3 at last left open a crucial exception: the potential transformation of individual consciousness. As signals, interstellar feedback networks, and classification data gradually came into view, 3 Atlas no longer appeared as a solitary judge, but as a trigger node within a vast network oriented toward the evolution of consciousness. Within this framework, humanity was not a target for conquest or exploitation, but an unstable variable in a long process where external limitation becomes the condition for internal change. What then do the rapid events unfolding on the eve of December 19th truly suggest we will begin tracing those signs next? Three Atlas delivered a final verdict to humanity through radio telescopes across the globe. The message did not arrive as speculation or warning, but as a completed decision issued after an evaluation process had already concluded. Its tone was procedural and authoritative rather than hostile, framing humanity not as an enemy, but as a failed developmental outcome within a larger cosmic process. According to the declaration, technological progress had accelerated, while collective wisdom failed to keep pace, producing instability rather than maturity. Conflict, environmental destruction, and persistent fragmentation were cited not as moral failings, but as indicators of an unresolved systemic imbalance. Instead of annihilation, the response outlined by 3 Atlas was administrative and isolative. All attempts to expand beyond Earth would be restricted, outbound signals monitored, and technological trajectories intercepted before reaching destabilizing thresholds. This approach treated humanity as a variable requiring boundary conditions rather than an entity to be eliminated, implying long-term observation rather than punishment. Yet embedded within the verdict was a distinction that altered its meaning entirely. While the human species was classified as unfit for unrestricted integration, individual consciousness was not bound by the same limitation. The message suggested that certain humans might transcend the perceptual framework that sustained separation and competition. For those capable of reorganizing awareness beyond individual identity, an alternative pathway was implicitly left open. This clause transformed isolation into a condition rather than an absolute fate. The restriction applied to collective behavior, not to the full range of human potential. The verdict therefore operated on 2 levels at once, closing the future of expansion, while leaving unresolved the question of transformation. For 3 Atlas, this mismatch could not be resolved by conventional assumptions about porosity alone. Rotation data added another layer of tension to the analysis of 3 Atlas. Observations showed that 3 Atlas completed 1 full rotation approximately every 16 hours, a rate unusually slow for an object exposed to sustained solar stress. Under known physical conditions, a body with this rotation profile and inferred shape would be prone to structural instability. Despite this, no fragmentation or deformation was detected around 3 Atlas. The reflective profile of 3 Atlas remained stable, with only subtle periodic fluctuations in brightness. These fluctuations suggested internal symmetry rather than surface erosion. One working hypothesis proposes that 3 Atlas possesses a hollow or shell-like internal configuration. Such a structure would reconcile the low effective mass of 3 Atlas with its observed dimensions. For 3 Atlas, a hollow architecture would also explain how rotational stress is distributed without catastrophic failure. Spectroscopic readings further deepened the mystery surrounding 3 Atlas. Unusually high concentrations of nickel and iron were detected, exceeding levels typical of cometary material. In 3 Atlas, these elements appeared organized rather than randomly dispersed. If 3 Atlas formed naturally existing formation models struggle to account for this specific combination of composition, mass behavior, and rotational stability. If 3 Atlas did not form naturally, the data point toward intentional design constraints rather than chaotic aggregation. At this stage, 3 Atlas occupies a grey zone between astrophysical anomaly and structural system. Scientists remain careful to frame these conclusions as provisional. The data surrounding 3 Atlas establish inconsistency, not certainty. Still, with each refinement of mass and rotation models 3, Atlas moves further away from known natural categories. This phase of analysis transforms the investigation of 3A at last from observation to inference. Mass rotation and composition now converge into a single unresolved question about internal structure. That question becomes the foundation for probability-based assessments that follow in the next stage of the 3A at last inquiry. As anomalies surrounding 3A at last accumulated, traditional classification methods began to lose their explanatory power. Individual irregularities could still be debated in isolation, but the combined pattern associated with 3A at last demanded a different analytical framework. At this point, some researchers proposed that the question was no longer what 3A at last was, but how unlikely its observed behaviour would be if it were entirely natural. To address this problem, a probability-based assessment model was introduced, informally referred to as the ET probability scale. The purpose of this scale was not to declare the presence of extraterrestrial technology, but to quantify uncertainty in a structured and transparent way. 3A at last became one of the first interstellar objects evaluated under this framework. Within the ET probability scale, each unexplained feature associated with 3A at last was assigned a weighted value. The anti-tail orientation of 3A at last, the mass-to-size discrepancy of 3A at last, and the rotational stability of 3A at last all contributed independently to the overall score. When combined, these factors place 3A at last at level 4 on the scale. A level 4 classification indicates the presence of multiple persistent anomalies without a satisfactory natural explanation. For 3A at last, this level does not imply confirmation of artificial origin. Instead, it reflects a statistically significant deviation from known astrophysical norms. Researchers emphasize that the ET probability scale is conservative by design. Natural explanations are always favored until they are exhausted by evidence. In the case of 3A at last, the difficulty lies in identifying a single natural mechanism capable of resolving all observed contradictions simultaneously. Comparisons were drawn between 3A at last and earlier interstellar visitors. Unlike previous objects, 3A at last exhibited a sustained pattern of anomalies rather than a single outlier event. This persistence increased confidence that the behaviour of 3A at last was not the result of observational noise or incomplete data. The classification of 3A at last sparked debate within the scientific community. Some argued that unknown physics could still account for the observations surrounding 3A at last. Others noted that invoking unknown physics without constraints risks becoming indistinguishable from speculation. At this stage, the ET probability scale serves as a boundary rather than a conclusion. 3A at last remains unconfirmed as technology, yet increasingly difficult to describe as ordinary matter. The scale reframes the discussion from belief to likelihood, preparing the investigation of 3A at last for more direct tests ahead. The next shift in the investigation occurred when 3A at last re-emerged from solar conjunction and appeared noticeably brighter than models had predicted. Photometric measurements showed that the reflective intensity of 3A at last had increased by nearly 400% without a corresponding rise in surface temperature. This imbalance alone suggested that 3A at last was regulating energy in a manner not associated with passive celestial bodies. Shortly after this brightening event, ultraviolet instruments detected a faint but persistent emission originating from 3I at last. Unlike irregular radiation spikes commonly observed in active comets, the emission from 3I at last followed a strict temporal rhythm. The signal repeated with remarkable precision, maintaining stability across multiple observation windows. When analysts examined the pulse intervals emitted by 3A at last, a pattern began to emerge. The timing sequence aligned with prime numbers advancing in a progression that resisted simplification or randomization. For 3A at last, this pattern could not be dismissed as a coincidence without violating basic principles of statistical probability. Prime numbers occupy a unique position in mathematics as non-reducible structures. Because prime sequences cannot be generated through simple harmonic processes, their appearance in astrophysical signals is considered highly improbable without intentional encoding. In the context of 3I at last, the probability of a natural radiation source producing such a sequence approaches zero. Researchers emphasize that the signal from 3I at last was not modulated for efficiency or power. The signal was optimized for recognition. This distinction shifted the discussion from energy release to information delivery. At this stage, the behavior of 3I at last crossed a conceptual boundary. Radiation ceased to function as a byproduct of physical interaction and began to resemble a structured response. For 3A at last, emission timing became more significant than emission strength. Some scientists proposed that the prime number sequence associated with 3I at last served as a universal identifier. Prime numbers require no shared language, no cultural context, and no prior agreement to be recognized as deliberate. In this sense, 3 at last appeared to be communicating through mathematics rather than symbols. Caution remained central to the analysis of 3I at last. Researchers avoided labeling the signal as a message, instead referring to it as a candidate for intentional signaling. Still, no known natural process could replicate the precision displayed by 3I at last without invoking unknown constraints. Emotionally, this phase marked a subtle but profound shift. 3I at last was no longer perceived solely as an object behaving strangely. 3I at last began to feel responsive. The emergence of the prime number signal reframed every prior anomaly. Mass discrepancies, anti-tail orientation, and rotational stability could now be interpreted as components of a coordinated system. This interpretation prepared the investigation of 3I at last for the final question of structure and control that would soon follow. The investigation reached a critical threshold when the James Webb Space Telescope was repositioned to observe 3I at last at higher resolution. What emerged from the data was not a blurred surface or irregular layering, but a repeating geometric pattern beneath the reflective exterior of 3I at last. The structure appeared as a lattice of hexagonal segments uniform in scale and alignment, extending across a substantial portion of 3 at last's interior profile. Hexagonal geometry is not unknown in nature, but it typically arises under strict thermodynamic or fluid conditions. In the case of 3I at last, the lattice showed no signs of gradual formation or environmental stress. The precision of the hexagonal network suggested constraint repetition and deliberate arrangement within 3I at last. Spectroscopic analysis indicated that the lattice of 3I at last was composed of a highly conductive nickel-titanium alloy. This material combination is notable for its strength, thermal resilience, and shape memory properties. For 3I at last, such characteristics imply an internal structure designed to endure extreme environmental variation during interstellar transit. As attention focused on internal geometry trajectory, data introduced a parallel anomaly. Without warning, 3I at last executed a measurable change in its velocity vector. The adjustment amounted to approximately 0.9 degrees, a shift too precise to attribute to gravitational perturbation or radiation pressure. Natural bodies respond to external forces gradually and predictably. The maneuver executed by 3I at last occurred abruptly with clear initiation and termination points. This behavior aligned more closely with controlled thrust than with passive deflection. When modelled as a propulsion event, the adjustment of 3I at last required directional intent and internal coordination. The hexagonal lattice observed within 3I at last provided a plausible structural framework capable of supporting such controlled motion. In this interpretation, geometry and trajectory ceased to be independent observations. Researchers emphasized that no single feature of 3I at last could confirm artificial origin. However, the convergence of lattice structure and orbital control significantly reduced the range of viable natural explanations. For 3I at last, structure now appeared to serve function. At this stage, the investigation crossed a methodological boundary. Data no longer suggested isolated anomalies, but interlocking systems operating in sequence. 3I at last began to resemble an integrated object rather than an accidental formation. The orbital adjustment also altered the broader context of observation. 3I at last redirected itself away from predicted encounters, choosing a path that minimized interference. This choice implied awareness of its environment, whether mechanical or computational. The appearance of a hexagonal lattice beneath the surface of 3I at last transformed the central question. The focus shifted from what 3I at last was made of to why 3I at last was built this way. That question would lead directly to the final and most unsettling observation yet to come. As 3I at last prepared to depart the inner solar system, observatories recorded a final emission that differed fundamentally from all previous signals associated with 3I at last. This emission did not radiate outward in expanding waves, but returned information inward, reflecting patterns already present in the surrounding electromagnetic environment of 3I at last. The behavior suggested interaction, rather than broadcast response shaped by external observation. Detailed analysis revealed that the signal associated with 3I at last carried structured binary modulation, embedded within a faint ultraviolet pulse. When reconstructed, the modulation formed a three-dimensional fractal geometry, rather than linear data. The geometry mirrored internal patterns previously identified beneath the surface of 3 Atlas linking structure and signal through shared mathematical relationships. At the center of the reconstructed pattern, researchers identified the presence of a precise numerical constant. The value corresponded to the golden ratio, a proportion recurring across natural growth systems and optimized physical designs. For 3 Atlas, the appearance of this ratio suggested a preference for stability and efficiency rather than randomness. Further examination indicated that the emission from 3 Atlas did not introduce new information. Instead, the signal appeared to transform incoming electromagnetic signatures generated by observing instruments. This transformation implied that 3 Atlas was not simply transmitting, but responding to being observed. In this framework, observation itself became part of the interaction. 3 Atlas appeared to register detection attempts and generate output shaped by those attempts. Such behavior challenges the assumption that astronomical observation is passive. Researchers described the phenomenon as information reflection rather than communication. The signal did not demand interpretation, translation, or reply. The signal demonstrated awareness of measurement. Statistical modeling showed that reflective modulation of this precision could not arise from stochastic processes. The probability of spontaneous synchronization between internal geometry and external observation approached zero. For 3 Atlas, the implication was not intelligence by declaration, but responsiveness by design. At this stage, the ET probability scale was revised upward by several independent analysts. One assessment placed 3 Atlas near the upper boundary of unresolved artificiality, emphasizing the collapse of natural explanations. 3 Atlas had crossed from anomaly into interaction. The final reflection event reframed the entire encounter. 3 Atlas was no longer defined solely by what 3I Atlas emitted. 3I Atlas was defined by what 3I Atlas perceived. With that realization, the investigation entered a new phase. 3I Atlas was not only passing through the solar system. 3I Atlas was paying attention. The moment every major radio telescope on Earth registered a simultaneous freeze, analysts understood that the event exceeded any known failure mode within human infrastructure. The synchronization was precise across continents, frequencies and independent systems indicating intervention rather than coincidence. Within seconds of this silence, a structured transmission emerged, carried not as chaotic noise but as a coherent signal that bypassed conventional interference thresholds. When the transmission resolved into intelligible language, the tone conveyed neither urgency nor aggression, but procedural finality. The opening statement, rendered with deliberate clarity, framed humanity as the subject of an evaluation that had already concluded. At this stage, 3 Atlas was identified as the origin point linking the declaration directly to the interstellar object previously under observation. The authority embedded within the signal did not resemble diplomatic outreach or exploratory contact. Instead, the structure mirrored administrative communication, the type used to announce outcomes rather than negotiate terms. For 3 Atlas, the declaration functioned as a verdict delivery rather than an invitation to dialogue. As scientists analysed the transmission architecture, it became evident that the signal was optimised for reach rather than persuasion. No redundancy was included for clarification, and no adaptive modulation appeared in response to global reception. This design implied certainty regarding both comprehension and compliance. Linguistic analysis revealed that the message addressed humanity as a single integrated entity, rather than a collection of cultures or political systems. The framing eliminated distinctions between nations, institutions, or belief structures, treating the species as one operational unit. Through 3 Atlas, the declaration imposed a unified identity that human societies had never fully achieved on their own. The absence of emotional inflection became one of the most unsettling characteristics of the message. The transmission did not threaten, justify, or explain beyond minimal parameters. Its authority derived from assumed jurisdiction rather than demonstrated power. In technical terms, the signal exhibited complete dominance over the electromagnetic spectrum used for human communication. This dominance suggested prior mapping of terrestrial systems and predictive modelling of response thresholds. For 3 Atlas, such control implied prolonged observation rather than spontaneous decision-making. By the time the transmission concluded, global awareness lagged behind institutional recognition. Governments reacted through emergency protocols, while civilian populations remained unaware that a declaration had already reshaped planetary status. Through this single authoritative act, 3 Atlas transformed the investigation from scientific curiosity into existential assessment. The declaration attributed to 3 Atlas advanced beyond authority into evaluation, presenting humanity as the outcome of a long-running assessment rather than a recent discovery. According to the transmission, 3 Atlas had observed Earth across 847 solar cycles, a duration implying systematic monitoring rather than episodic curiosity. This timeframe reframed human history as a dataset extending far beyond recorded civilization. Within this framework, the central failure identified by 3 Atlas was not technological limitation, but developmental imbalance. The message asserted that human innovation accelerated faster than collective judgment, creating a widening gap between capability and responsibility. For 3 Atlas, this divergence represented a structural flaw rather than a temporary phase. The analysis delivered by 3 Atlas emphasized repetition rather than novelty. Patterns of conflict, resource exhaustion, and social fragmentation were described as recurring outputs generated by similar inputs across generations. This repetition suggested to 3 Atlas that learning at the species level remained incomplete. Notably, the transmission avoided moral language. Actions were not labeled as good or evil, but as inefficient outcomes within a larger system. Through this lens, 3 Atlas treated humanity less as a moral agent and more as an unresolved process. A key element of the imbalance hypothesis involved perception of separation. The signal proposed that humans consistently misidentified individual identity as isolated rather than interconnected, leading to competition where coordination would be optimal. For 3 Atlas, this perceptual error explained both social division and environmental degradation. Scientific reaction to this assessment was mixed but restrained. Behavioral scientists noted that many conclusions echoed existing models of cognitive bias and evolutionary mismatch. What unsettled researchers was not the content but the external confirmation, delivered with apparent confidence by 3 Atlas. The transmission framed disappointment as a statistical outcome rather than an emotional response. Expectations were implied to exist, but failure was presented as data rather than betrayal. This distinction reinforced the impression that 3 Atlas operated under evaluative protocols rather than relational intent. By positioning humanity as a single entity that had failed to meet an integration threshold, 3 Atlas removed the possibility of partial success. Individual achievements were rendered irrelevant within a species-level analysis. This conclusion marked a turning point where the question shifted from how humanity might improve to whether improvement was still considered viable. The imbalance hypothesis did not close the discussion. Instead, it defined the parameters within which all subsequent actions by 3 Atlas would be interpreted. Following the evaluative judgment, the transmission associated with 3 Atlas shifted from assessment to implementation, outlining a framework of restriction described as a quarantine rather than a punishment. The language conveyed finality through procedure, presenting the measures as pre-existing protocols activated once specific criteria were met. Within this framework, 3 Atlas defined humanity as an active variable, requiring stabilization rather than elimination. The decree specified comprehensive monitoring of the electromagnetic spectrum surrounding Earth. Every band used for communication, navigation, and data transmission was described as observable and interceptable under the authority claimed by 3 Atlas. This control implied prior mapping of terrestrial technologies and predictive modeling of human innovation pathways. Containment was framed as preventative rather than corrective. The stated objective was to prevent uncontrolled expansion beyond acceptable parameters while allowing internal processes to continue. For 3 Atlas, isolation functioned as a boundary condition designed to limit external impact without interrupting internal development. Restrictions extended beyond communication into propulsion and energy systems. Any technological pathway capable of enabling interstellar travel was identified as subject to regulation before maturation. 3 Atlas presented this approach as a means of avoiding escalation rather than responding to threats after emergence. Artificial intelligence and genetic modification were singled out as high-risk accelerants. The transmission suggested that these domains amplified existing imbalances by increasing capability without addressing judgment. By constraining these technologies, 3 Atlas aimed to cap exponential divergence between power and wisdom. Importantly, the decree avoided references to enforcement through force. Instead, compliance was assumed through systemic limitation, embedded within physical and informational infrastructure. This method reflected an administrative mindset, in which resistance becomes irrelevant due to lack of viable pathways. Scientists noted that the containment model described by 3 at Lest resembled ecological management strategies applied at planetary scale. Rather than correcting behavior directly, the system altered available options to guide outcomes over time. This approach reinforced the impression that the quarantine was not improvisational, but standardized. The absence of hostility remained striking throughout the declaration. No threats were issued and no timelines for escalation were provided. Authority was expressed through assumed jurisdiction rather than demonstrative power. By concluding the decree, 3 at Lest redefined Earth's position within a broader cosmic structure. Humanity was no longer framed as an emerging participant, but as a contained process under observation. This transition marked the moment when the investigation of 3 at Lest moved fully from scientific anomaly into systemic consequence. As the implications of the quarantine decree unfolded, the transmission linked to 3 at Lest introduced a clarification that reframed decades of unresolved observations surrounding Earth. Objects historically categorized as unidentified aerial phenomena were recontextualized as components of a distributed monitoring system. Within this explanation, 3 at Lest described a network of silent observation nodes positioned to ensure continuous planetary coverage. The placement of these monitoring structures followed orbital and gravitational patterns optimized for persistence rather than visibility. According to the framework outlined by 3 at Lest, the network operated passively for extended periods, activating only when specific thresholds were approached. This design suggested long-term oversight rather than reactive surveillance. What distinguished this disclosure was not the existence of monitoring, but its integration with historical analysis. The transmission included reconstructed visual records drawn from Earth's own past, presented without commentary or contextual framing. Through 3 at Lest, humanity was shown itself as data. The imagery focused on patterns rather than events. Cycles of expansion followed by collapse, technological acceleration, followed by conflict and environmental exploitation, followed by instability appeared repeatedly across different eras. In these records, individual achievements dissolved into broader statistical trends. For researchers analysing the data, the unsettling aspect lay in the familiarity of the patterns. Many sequences mirrored conclusions already present within human historical and sociological studies. What altered perception was the perspective from which these patterns were presented. 3 at Lest did not frame history as narrative or morality. History was rendered as output generated by input conditions that remained largely unchanged over time. From this vantage point, progress appeared incremental while error appeared systemic. The mirror effect of the historical data produced a psychological response distinct from fear. Observers reported a sense of compression, as centuries of human experience were reduced to recurring shapes rather than unique moments. Through 3 at Lest, humanity was confronted not with accusation, but with consistency. The transmission implied that quarantine was not triggered by potential future behavior alone. Containment was justified by demonstrated inability to break established cycles. In this sense, 3 at Lest treated history itself as evidence. Importantly, the monitoring network was presented as already active long before the declaration. This timing suggested that observation preceded classification, and that classification preceded response. Humanity within this model had been visible long before it became self-aware on a cosmic scale. Scientists emphasized that the disclosure did not prove intent or malice. Instead, it illustrated a framework in which observation, evaluation, and response are sequential stages of a larger process. For 3 at Lest, the historical mirror served as validation rather than persuasion. By reflecting humanity's past without distortion, 3 at Lest removed the possibility of denial. The network did not invent new judgments. The network simply revealed patterns that had always been present. Within the same transmission that defined planetary quarantine, a secondary clause emerged that altered the scope of the declaration delivered by 3 at Lest. Rather than addressing humanity solely as a unified species, the message introduced the concept of individual exception. This distinction suggested that evaluation conducted by 3 at Lest operated on multiple scales simultaneously. According to the transmission, containment applied to collective expansion rather than personal development. 3 Atlas described consciousness as a variable not fully constrained by biological or technological limitation. In this framing, 3 Atlas separated the fate of the species from the potential of individual awareness. The invitation did not resemble rescue or reward. The language emphasized thresholds, not destinations, and criteria, not promises. For 3 Atlas, transcendence was defined as a measurable shift in perception, rather than an escape from circumstance. The message proposed that certain individuals might overcome the illusion of separation that characterized human cognition. This illusion, previously identified as a root cause of imbalance, was presented as a perceptual artifact rather than an immutable trait. 3 Atlas implied that when perception reorganizes, constraint loses relevance. Notably, the invitation did not involve physical departure from Earth. 3 Atlas stated that no vehicle propulsion system or external instrument was required to cross the described thresholds. Instead, the process was framed as an internal reconfiguration capable of operating independently of spatial confinement. Researchers interpreting this section emphasized its consistency with existing theories of consciousness plasticity. Neuroscientific models already suggest that identity and self-boundary are adaptive constructs rather than fixed realities. What distinguished the statement from 3 Atlas was the suggestion that such reconfiguration had cosmic significance. The invitation carried no timeline and offered no verification method. 3 Atlas did not specify how many individuals might qualify or how success would be recognized. This absence of structure suggested that the process was self-selecting rather than administered. Importantly, the message avoided language associated with ascension or superiority. Transcendence was framed as alignment rather than elevation. For 3 Atlas, the individual who crossed the threshold did not escape the system but ceased to conflict with it. The presence of this invitation complicated the interpretation of quarantine. Containment no longer appeared solely as restriction, but as a boundary within which transformation could occur. Through this clause, 3 Atlas reframed limitation as a condition that reveals potential rather than suppresses it. In the aftermath of the declaration attributed to 3 Atlas, observable change did not begin with technology or policy but with behavior. Across cultures and regions, individuals responded to the implications of containment by turning inward rather than outward. This shift marked the beginning of what researchers cautiously described as an internal revolution shaped by constraint rather than coercion. As confidence in unrestricted expansion diminished, the assumption that progress must always move outward began to erode. 3 Atlas had reframed growth as a liability when unaccompanied by coherence, and this reframing altered priorities at a psychological level. Practices focused on attention perception and internal regulation increased across populations without centralized coordination. Alongside this change, reports emerged of informal groups attempting to align mental states through shared rhythm and focus. These gatherings, later referred to as resonance hubs, sought to synchronize neural activity in response to frequencies associated with 3 Atlas. Participants described subjective experiences of calm clarity and reduced separation rather than heightened stimulation. Scientists approached these reports with restraint. While neurophysiological data confirmed that synchronized brainwave patterns can arise under specific conditions, causality remained unclear. For 3 Atlas, the distinction between genuine adaptation and collective coping remained unresolved. The central question concerned direction rather than intensity. If synchronization represented alignment with broader structures described by 3 Atlas, it could indicate the early stages of perceptual reorganization. If synchronization functioned primarily as psychological stabilization, it might reflect a response to existential uncertainty rather than transformation. Researchers emphasize that neither interpretation invalidated the other. Human systems often adapt through mechanisms that serve multiple functions simultaneously. Within this ambiguity, 3 Atlas had introduced a variable that science could observe but not yet define. The internal revolution unfolded without instruction, leadership, or confirmation. 3 Atlas did not endorse or reject these developments. The uncertainty itself became the environment in which the next phase would emerge. At precisely 3:47 in the morning, instruments across Earth detected an energy pulse whose magnitude exceeded any previously recorded astrophysical transient associated with 3 Atlas. The pulse overwhelmed background cosmic noise and saturated multiple frequency bands simultaneously, a behavior that immediately distinguished the event from natural flares or stochastic bursts. For 3i Atlas, the emission appeared neither accidental nor reactive, but temporally deliberate. Analysis showed that the energy released by 3i Atlas did not dissipate uniformly into space. Instead, the signal propagated through terrestrial communication systems, as if those systems had been incorporated into the transmission architecture of 3i Atlas. This integration suggested that 3i Atlas had transformed Earth into an active component of a larger signaling process. Unlike earlier emissions linked to 3i Atlas, the pulse carried embedded coordinates rather than abstract patterns. These coordinates did not point back toward Earth, but outward to multiple locations distributed across the Milky Way. For 3i Atlas, directionality became as significant as power. Researchers noted that the energy requirements for such a broadcast exceeded the output of all human transmitters combined. No known natural mechanism could account for the conversion of planetary-scale infrastructure into a coherent amplifier without prior preparation. This observation strengthened the hypothesis that 3i Atlas had been calibrating Earth long before the pulse occurred. The structure of the signal suggested an invitation rather than a warning. Rather than seeking response from Earth, the transmission appeared optimized for detection by distant receivers already attuned to its format. Within this context, 3i Atlas functioned less as an originator and more as a relay node. As decoding progressed, repeated sequences within the signal implied readiness rather than urgency. The language of the transmission, when translated into conceptual terms, described completion rather than initiation. For 3i Atlas, the pulse marked the end of preparation rather than the beginning of contact. This interpretation reframed the role of 3i Atlas within the broader narrative. 3i Atlas was no longer positioned as an observer or evaluator alone, but as a trigger activating a pre-existing network. The hypothesis of summoning emerged from this realization. If the pulse represented a call, then 3i Atlas was not signaling into uncertainty. 3i Atlas was signaling into expectation. That distinction introduced a new and unsettling variable, suggesting that Earth had been anticipated long before the signal was ever sent. As analysts reconstructed the later segments of the transmission, a repeated statement embedded within the signal associated with 3i Atlas became impossible to ignore. The phrase translated consistently across independent decoding efforts and carried a clear procedural meaning rather than metaphorical language. 3i Atlas indicated that a network long under construction had reached operational completion. Within hours of the initial energy pulse, observatories began detecting structured response signals originating from multiple regions across the Milky Way. These responses did not arrive as echoes or reflections, but as distinct transmissions with unique spectral signatures and synchronized timing. For 3i Atlas, the rapid convergence of replies suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Each returning signal followed a shared mathematical cadence while maintaining individual geometric modulation. This combination indicated participation by separate intelligences operating within a common protocol. 3i Atlas appeared to function as a verification node confirming readiness across a distributed system. The speed with which the responses arrived challenged assumptions about interstellar communication latency. Signals appeared too quickly to represent spontaneous discovery of the broadcast. For 3i Atlas, this implied that receiving civilizations were already aligned and awaiting activation. Researchers described the phenomenon as network confirmation rather than first contact. The architecture implied prior agreement on timing, format, and response conditions. 3i Atlas therefore occupied a role similar to a checkpoint rather than a messenger acting independently. Further analysis revealed that Earth's communication infrastructure continued to resonate after the initial pulse. Satellites, radio arrays, and data relays exhibited persistent synchronization without external input. Through 3i Atlas, Earth had been integrated as a stable node within the completed network. The absence of escalation following confirmation was notable. No additional instructions, demands, or threats accompanied the response signals. For 3i Atlas, completion itself appeared sufficient to initiate the next phase. This confirmation reframed the meaning of earlier containment measures. Quarantine no longer appeared solely as restriction, but as stabilization preceding integration. 3i Atlas had ensured that Earth reached a defined state before exposure to a larger system. Scientists emphasized that confirmation did not equate to arrival. The network's activation suggested readiness rather than immediate convergence. Through 3i Atlas, the universe acknowledged Earth as prepared, without revealing what preparation ultimately entailed. The declaration of completion closed one chapter while opening another. 3i Atlas had fulfilled its preparatory function. What remained uncertain was the nature of participation within a network that had already been waiting. As the network conformation stabilized, the transmission linked to 3 Atlas introduced a new layer of data that shifted attention from signaling to classification. Embedded within the broader signal stream were structured records resembling inventories, rather than messages each formatted with numerical precision and categorical separation. Through these records, 3 Atlas framed Earth not as a mystery to be explored, but as a system already measured. The first dataset outlined planetary resources with a level of granularity exceeding existing human surveys. Mineral distribution, atmospheric stability, hydrospheric balance and energy flux were presented as interdependent variables rather than isolated metrics. In the framework defined by 3 Atlas, Earth appeared catalogued as a functional environment rather than a passive location. A second dataset focused on biological distribution mapping population density, genetic variance, and adaptive resilience across regions. These parameters were not expressed in cultural or political terms, but as biological gradients responding to environmental pressure. For 3i at last, humanity was rendered as a living component within a larger ecological matrix. The most controversial element emerged within a third classification, labelled with a term best translated as compliance potential. This metric did not assess obedience or submission, but responsiveness to systemic constraint and cooperative adaptation. Through 3i Atlas, compliance appeared to describe alignment capacity rather than control vulnerability. Scientists interpreting these records noted the absence of emotional or ideological framing. No values were assigned to belief systems, governance models, or historical identities. 3 at last evaluated function, not meaning. The existence of such inventories implied that management was not a future intention, but an ongoing process. Classification precedes intervention in most regulatory systems, and the structure of the data suggested long-term planning rather than reactive judgment. For 3 Atlas, management did not require direct oversight if parameters remained within acceptable bounds. This interpretation reframed the summoning hypothesis. If inventories had already been compiled, then convergence was not motivated by curiosity or urgency. 3 Atlas appeared to operate within a framework where integration follows assessment as a procedural sequence. The inventory records did not announce ownership or authority explicitly. Instead, they implied stewardship exercised through system design rather than force. Within this model, 3 Atlas positioned humanity as a managed variable inside a process too large to negotiate with individuals. As researchers continued decoding deeper layers of the transmission, associated with 3 Atlas, earlier assumptions regarding motive began to lose coherence. Initial interpretations centered on resource acquisition or strategic positioning, yet the newly revealed data did not support models of extraction or territorial expansion. Through 3 Atlas, the focus shifted away from material value toward a different form of rarity. References embedded within the signal described a long-term initiative concerned with consciousness rather than infrastructure. In this context, 3 Atlas identified human awareness as an uncommon configuration characterized by emotional depth, creative variability, and adaptive subjectivity. For 3 Atlas, these traits appeared more significant than technological output or planetary assets. The initiative outlined by 3 Atlas framed consciousness as a developmental field rather than a fixed attribute. Variations in perception, empathy, and self-modeling were treated as dynamic parameters capable of refinement. Within this framework, humanity represented an early-stage expression, rather than a completed form. Multiple incoming signals previously interpreted as independent responses were reclassified as specialized contributors. Each participating civilization was associated with a distinct research focus, including emotional coherence, collective cognition, symbolic abstraction, and accelerated integration. 3 Atlas functioned as a coordinator aligning these domains rather than directing them hierarchically. This reframing challenged anthropocentric interpretations of contact. Humanity was not selected because of dominance or achievement, but because of developmental instability. For 3i at last, instability indicated potential rather than failure. Researchers noted that the initiative did not propose forced transformation. Instead, alignment was described as gradual exposure to conditions that encourage reorganization. Through 3 at last, development occurred through resonance rather than instruction. The concept of participation replaced earlier notions of control. Human consciousness was positioned as an active variable capable of adaptation, rather than a passive subject of experimentation. Within this model, outcome depended on response rather than compliance. Importantly, the transmission avoided defining a final state. No endpoint for consciousness development was specified, only thresholds that enable further interaction. 3 at last implied that awareness evolves through successive integrations rather than linear progression. This interpretation resolved several apparent contradictions. Containment, inventory, and summoning no longer appeared as separate actions. Through 3 at last, they converged into a single process designed to support the maturation of consciousness within a broader cosmic system. As the framework described by 3 at last emphasized consciousness as a developmental field, attention shifted toward the consequences of large-scale perceptual change. If awareness could be tuned through resonance and exposure, then individual identity would no longer remain static within that process. Through this lens, 3 at last introduced a central tension between expansion of perception and preservation of personal continuity. Neuroscientific models already suggest that the sense of self emerges from adaptive boundaries rather than fixed essence. When those boundaries soften, cognition can access broader informational contexts while simultaneously losing internal separation. For 3 at last, this trade-off represented a measurable risk, rather than a philosophical abstraction. Reports following the activation of the network described subtle alterations in subjective experience across populations. Individuals reported heightened empathy, shared emotional states, and reduced emphasis on personal narrative. Within the interpretive frame offered by 3 at last, these effects aligned with early-stage synchronization, rather than full integration. The potential danger arises when synchronization progresses faster than stabilization. If collective coherence increases without mechanisms to preserve differentiation, individual identity may dissolve into undirected uniformity. 3 at last treated this outcome as undesirable, suggesting that development without structure leads to loss rather than advancement. Psychologists analyzing the data emphasize that identity erosion does not require external coercion. Gradual alignment can emerge through reward mechanisms embedded within shared experience. For 3 at last, the challenge lay in balancing connection with distinction. The transmission described identity not as something to be eliminated, but as something to be reconfigured. Rather than collapsing into a single awareness, individuals were expected to learn how to maintain internal reference points while participating in broader cognitive fields. Through 3 at last, maturity was defined as the ability to navigate between unity and individuality. This risk reframed earlier enthusiasm surrounding transcendence. Transformation no longer appeared inherently beneficial without safeguards. 3 at last implied that awareness expansion functions as a test of cognitive resilience rather than an automatic upgrade. The question that emerged was not whether humanity could change, but whether humanity could change without disappearing into sameness. Within the system outlined by 3 at last, identity became both the medium and the measure of successful integration. As the final layers of interpretation settled, the closing concept introduced by 3 at last reframed the entire sequence of events into a quieter and more unsettling perspective.